You think money makes you a man? Everyone here knows you're just a paycheck, nothing more. My uncle's voice cracked across the crowded restaurant like a whip, and for a second the clinking of silverware. The laughter from the other tables and the muted hum of the televisions above the bar all seemed to fold inward toward me as faces turned. Some grinning with the sly delight of witnesses to another man's humiliation, some pretending to sip their drinks to hide the fact that they were watching me unravel, and I felt the heat in my chest crawl up my throat as if my own blood was trying to choke me. But I kept my hands steady against the table because if I clenched my fists, even once they would know they got to me, and that would be worse than the sting of his words. Before we get deeper into this story, make sure you're subscribed, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're listening from. I remember thinking, absurdly, that this was the exact kind of moment people talk about years later, when a man either folds or finds something sharper inside himself, and while he sat there with his belly pressing against the buttons of his shirt, smirking as if the whole family had been waiting for him to deliver that line, I let myself imagine the weight of a secret they couldn't see. The kind of card you keep pressed tight against your chest until the moment comes to lay it down and flip the whole damn table. My name is Daniel Hayes. I'm 38 years old, born and raised in Cleveland, Ohio, and I've worked every kind of job a man can work when he doesn't come from money but refuses to sink into the mud his parents drowned in. From unloading trucks on graveyard shifts with my back screaming under the weight of boxes stamped with destinations I would never see, to sitting behind a desk at an insurance firm where fluorescent lights carved into my skull until I thought I'd go blind, to the job I have now, corporate project manager. A title fancy enough to impress people who care about titles, but empty enough that some nights I stare at my computer screen, wondering if I've traded my life for a salary and a stack of bills that only grow taller every time I blink. There's a kind of loneliness to being the one who always pays, the one who's called dependable until the day that dependability becomes invisible, like furniture that holds the whole room together but never earns a compliment. And I've carried that weight so long that it's fused to my spine, but here's what they don't know. Furniture remembers when people spill on it, scratch it, abuse it, and one day it collapses at the exact moment they need it most. The room smelled of marinara and beer, the overhead bulbs throwing a golden haze over the booths, and somewhere behind me the jukebox was cycling through old Springsteen tracks that made me think of my father's rusted-out truck and the nights he drove us home from Little League games, his face half-shadowed by the dash lights as he hummed tunelessly. A man who taught me that loyalty wasn't about words, but about showing up even when you were tired, even when nobody clapped. And I carried that lesson like a relic, even as the people I carried it for sharpened it into a blade against me. My sister sat 2 chairs down, in a dress too formal for a family dinner, her hair pinned up like she wanted every glance in the room, and when my uncle's jab landed, she didn't flinch, didn't protest, didn't even meet my eyes, and that silence told me more than the words. That she had chosen her side long before tonight, that maybe this dinner was just the stage for a betrayal already written. There was a bottle of whiskey at the end of the table, unopened, its amber trapped behind glass catching the light like frozen fire, and I thought of how many times I'd poured from bottles just like it on nights when I needed to quiet the noise in my head, the ritual of a slow pour into a heavy-bottomed glass, the way the scent hit like old oak and regret. And how whiskey had become both anchor and crutch, a companion that didn't judge me when my phone buzzed with another request for help from family, who never thought twice about the hours I'd bled to earn it. I reached for water instead, my throat dry but my mind sharp, because I wasn't about to give them the satisfaction of watching me dull the edges. Not tonight, not when I could already feel the shape of something shifting in the air, a current pulling me toward a storm they couldn't imagine. Sometimes I think humiliation has a taste. Metallic like the tang of blood when you bite down on your own tongue to stop words from spilling, and as I sat there with eyes boring into me, I thought of how every sacrifice I'd made for them was suddenly nothing but smoke, that the tuition checks for my sister's college, the hospital bill I paid when my mother slipped and broke her arm, the down payment I handed my brother so he wouldn't lose his house, all of it had been erased by a single sneer from a man who never once lifted a finger except to point it at others. And here's the thing, betrayal doesn't land like a single stab, it arrives like an orchestra, every instrument hitting at once until you can't tell which cut hurts more. But I've learned that music can be rearranged, and sometimes the same notes that were meant to crush you can be played back louder, sharper, until the crowd rises for you instead of them. My sister finally looked at me then, her eyes cold in a way that made the room tilt. And I remembered the nights we used to sit on the back porch, 2 kids listening to cicadas, swearing we'd never let the world break us apart, swearing that whatever else happened, blood was blood. And it struck me with the force of a hammer that some promises don't shatter. They rot slowly until by the time you smell the decay, it's already too late. I wanted to stand up, slam my chair back, throw every debt and receipt I carried in their faces. But instead I sat perfectly still and smiled, the kind of smile that doesn't reach your eyes, the kind of smile that makes people wonder what you know that they don't. And inside I whispered to myself a philosophy I'd come to believe the hard way. Sometimes silence is louder than shouting, because silence makes them wait for the sound that comes next. And in that pause lies all the power. The waitress passed by with plates steaming like engines, her perfume cutting through the haze of garlic and fried dough, and I realized with sudden clarity that this dinner wasn't a dinner. It was a funeral, only I wasn't the one in the casket. They were burying my loyalty, shoveling dirt on the last piece of me that belonged to them. And I let them, because only when something's buried can you decide whether to dig it up again or leave it to rot while you plant something better in its place. And as I pushed my glass of water in a slow circle on the table, watching the condensation trail down like sweat, I thought of another line I would carry with me, one I'd repeat in the mirror later to remind myself. Trust is like glass. It doesn't warn you before it breaks, but when it shatters, you can cut them with the pieces if you're patient enough. The condensation on that glass slid into a thin ring on the wood, and I kept tracing it with my finger as though I could hold myself steady against the tide of stairs pressing on my shoulders. And the strange part was that the quieter I became, the more restless the table grew, as if they needed me to snap, needed me to break so they could point and say, there it is. Proof that Daniel's just a wallet with a temper. But I wasn't giving them that, because the only thing stronger than anger is restraint, and I'd been learning restraint since I was a boy, waiting at the window for a father who never came back from the bar until sunrise, reeking of smoke and excuses. And in that childhood waiting, I had built muscles not in my arms but in my patience. Muscles that knew how to hold until the world turned. My sister laughed then, not loudly, but with the kind of laugh that slices because it's meant only for the ears of those who already decided you're the joke, and she leaned closer to my mother, whispering something that made the older woman nod with pursed lips, and I caught the faintest echo. He'll always think money buys love. And that cut deeper than my uncle's words because it told me she had rehearsed this, that she had built her new identity on dismissing the years I spent making sure her fridge wasn't empty, her car didn't stall out on the freeway, her credit score didn't sink like a stone. That was the moment when something invisible snapped in me. Not a rage, not a scream, but a clean snap like a bowstring pulled too far and finally loosed. And I knew with the kind of certainty that only comes once in a lifetime that whatever story we'd been writing as a family had just turned, that the man they thought they could humiliate would not be the man who showed up tomorrow, or next week, or on the days she thought would be the peak of her life. The waitress set down my plate, steam curling upward like ghosts, and I forced myself to pick up the fork slowly, deliberately, chewing even as my throat felt raw, because sometimes dignity is just pretending the food doesn't taste like ashes. Over at the bar, a group of guys in Browns jerseys cheered at the screen, one of them slapping the counter so hard his beer sloshed, and for a moment I envied them, men whose biggest fight tonight was whether a wide receiver could catch in double coverage, but envy quickly hardened into something sharper. Clarity. The realization that I'd spent too many years playing the role of background character in my own life while everyone else wrote themselves as the hero. I swallowed, drank my water, and let the whiskey bottle at the far end catch my eye again, its cork sealed, waiting, like it understood that patience wasn't weakness but strategy. And I thought to myself that when I finally did uncork what I was holding inside, it would not be in this room, it would not be in front of these leeches, it would be on my terms. And the sound of that cork popping would echo longer than any of their cruel laughter. My sister reached for her phone then, checking something with a half smile, the kind that told me it was a message from him. The fiancé I'd never met, the one I only heard about through filtered mentions. Like a shadow she pretended wasn't there until suddenly he was everything. And it was in that movement that the betrayal became flesh, because even as I sat here, the one who had covered her bills and shielded her from storms, she hadn't told me the truth, hadn't told me about the dates circled in red on her calendar, the invitations probably already sent out without my name on them, and the absurdity of it nearly made me laugh, because it was one thing to be mocked at dinner, another thing entirely to realize you weren't even invited to the play where you'd been funding the set. I chewed slower, tasted salt that wasn't from the food, and forced my mind to stay calm, because clarity only comes when you let the wound bleed without trying to cover it. And in that bleeding, I saw what had to be done. I would not beg. I would not fight for a seat at her table. I would build my own, larger, shinier, so bright that when she looked at it, she'd see only her own reflection twisted by regret. Sometimes I think about rituals, the small ones that hold our days together like stitches. And mine has always been coffee in the morning, black, no sugar, no cream, just bitter and honest. The kind of drink that doesn't lie about what it is. And I thought of tomorrow's cup as I sat there, thought of the first sip searing my tongue while I stared out the kitchen window. The world still dark, and it felt like a promise to myself that even if every person at this table turned their back on me, I would keep that ritual, keep that one honest thing, and maybe that would be enough to build on. Because here's another truth I've learned, and maybe it's worth someone else carrying too. Family can abandon you, friends can betray you, but rituals are loyal. They show up every single day whether you're winning or crawling, and in their repetition you find a rhythm that no betrayal can silence. The noise of the restaurant swelled as if the walls themselves were laughing, but I just sat there, tasting bitterness, listening to the crack of pool balls from the back corner, watching a kid chase after his little brother between tables while their mother scolded them. And I thought how strange it was that even in the middle of humiliation, the world keeps spinning its ordinary gears. That pain doesn't stop time, it just makes your seconds feel heavier, like coins you can't spend. My sister stood then, brushing invisible crumbs from her dress, excusing herself to the restroom, and I caught the flick of her eyes toward me, a glance not of apology but of dismissal, like a queen brushing past a servant. And in that glance I saw the whole shape of what was coming, though I kept my face unreadable because masks are sometimes the sharpest armor. My uncle raised his glass as if toasting himself, muttering something about real men under his breath, and I almost smiled, because a thought bloomed in me like a secret fire. They had no idea how real men strike back, not with fists in a restaurant, but with patience, with planning, with timing so perfect, it feels like fate. I watched the thin line of my sister's back retreat toward the restroom, the sway of her dress catching the glow of pendant lights, and I let my eyes drop back to the table, tracing the knife against the edge of the plate, not because I planned to use it, but because the metallic scrape grounded me, a reminder that even in moments when you feel invisible, there is always texture, friction, proof that you exist beyond the way they frame you. And I held on to that as my uncle launched into another story about his glory days on the factory line, bragging about promotions that never came and buddies who had long since stopped calling, his voice carrying like a drunk announcer at a half-empty game. And I thought to myself that his whole life had been nothing but echoes, and maybe humiliating me was the only original sound he had left to make. My mother sat stiff, her fingers tight around her glass of water, her face carefully neutral in that way parents adopt when they know a fight is happening, but choose to let silence absolve them. And in that silence I realized she too had chosen convenience over loyalty, and though it broke something in me to admit it, the break also felt liberating, like a chain snapping after years of rubbing my skin raw. I chewed the last of my food, swallowed, and let my eyes wander to the untouched whiskey bottle again. The cork still a promise, and I thought how strange it was that objects outlive our lies, that glass and oak remember what people forget. And I knew then that this bottle was more than decoration. It was a symbol, though I didn't yet know how it would thread itself back into the story I was beginning to write in my mind. The waitress returned with the check, sliding it toward me like it was a foregone conclusion, and I almost laughed because of course it came to me, of course I was expected to pick up the bill, even after being gutted alive at the table. Even after being told I was nothing but a bank account with a face. And I didn't hesitate. I reached into my wallet and laid the card down. But inside I was grinning at the absurdity, because they thought this was another one of those nights where Daniel pays and everyone goes home comfortable. But I knew, deep in my chest, that this would be the last meal they'd ever eat on my dime. It's funny how endings don't announce themselves with trumpets. Sometimes they slip into place as quietly as a credit card sliding into a checkbook. My brother clapped me on the shoulder in mock gratitude, the weight of his hand condescending more than affectionate, and I let him, because I had already begun the process of detaching, already started seeing these people not as my family, but as characters in a play I had accidentally funded, and the curtain was about to fall whether they knew it or not. We walked out into the night, the air carrying the faint bite of early spring, headlights sweeping across the parking lot as cars pulled out, and for a moment I just stood there under the buzzing lamppost, the kind that flickered like a failing heartbeat, and I inhaled deep, the smell of fried food clinging to my jacket, the kind of scent that usually annoyed me but tonight felt like armor. A reminder that this night was real, that I wasn't dreaming the collapse of everything I thought I knew. My sister slipped into her car without a word, engine roaring to life, her taillights glowing red like twin warnings before she vanished, and I stayed behind, letting the rest of them disperse, until it was just me and the hum of the lamp and the ache in my chest. I pulled my phone from my pocket, stared at the blank screen, and almost typed a message. A question, a demand, a plea, but my thumb hovered above the keys and then fell away, because I knew better than to beg entry into a place where I'd already been written out. Instead, I opened my notes app and wrote one sentence. They will remember what they threw away. On the drive home, I let the radio run, country station fuzzing in and out with twangy voices singing about heartbreak and pickup trucks, and the rhythm of it made the road feel endless. Each mile marker another beat in a drum that was growing louder in my chest. I thought about rituals again, about the coffee waiting for me in the morning, about the way I'd grind the beans myself and let the smell fill the kitchen, and I realized that even if I lost everything else, family, respect, belonging, that small ritual was still mine, still proof that I could build a day from nothing. There's a philosophy I whispered aloud then, letting the words hang in the dim glow of the dashboard. A man is not the sum of who sits at his table. He's the architect of the table he chooses to build. The steering wheel was slick under my palms, the kind of tackiness that comes after hours of driving with the windows cracked, and I thought about how often I had been the designated driver, the one who carried everyone else safely home while no one cared if I made it back in one piece. And I laughed quietly at the irony that now, for the first time, I was steering only for myself. I pulled into my driveway, the small two-story house crouched in its quiet cul-de-sac. Porch light I'd left on glowing like a sentinel, and for once it felt less like home and more like headquarters, a place where the planning would begin. Inside, I shed my jacket, poured myself a glass of water, and sat at the kitchen table staring at the wood grain, running my finger along its lines as though they could tell me the future. My laptop sat on the counter, the lid shut, and I imagined the weight of opportunities it held, tickets I could book, messages I could send, contracts I could review, each one a tool sharper than any blade. I didn't know the shape of my revenge yet, only that it would not be loud, it would not be messy, it would not be something they could dismiss as anger. It would be precise, patient, devastating in its elegance. And as I finally stood, rinsed my glass, and prepared the coffee pot for morning, I felt the kind of calm that only comes when you stop asking why and start asking how, and that calm carried me into the dark hallway where the only sound was the hum of the fridge and the faint echo of my uncle's words. Already fading, already becoming fuel. I woke before the alarm, the kind of wakefulness that doesn't come from rest but from something gnawing at your ribs, and the room was still black except for the faint orange bleed of the street lamp outside the blinds. Shadows striped across the ceiling like prison bars, and for a few seconds I just lay there, listening to the silence. The hum of the refrigerator carrying through the walls, the creak of the house settling in the cold dawn. And I felt the weight of last night pressing down, but not crushing me, more like a hand on my chest, daring me to push back. I rose, barefoot against the cool wood floor, and padded into the kitchen where the coffee maker sat like a loyal soldier waiting for orders, and I measured out the beans, ground them slow, breathing in the bitter fragrance as it filled the room. The smell so sharp it felt like it could cut through memory itself, and I poured water, pressed the button, and watched as the dark liquid streamed down into the pot. Steady, relentless, honest, the way I wanted to be. I poured the first cup, wrapped my hands around the mug, felt the heat seep into my palms, and I thought about how small acts of loyalty like this cup were stronger than the grand gestures of family who couldn't keep their promises, and I sipped, burning my tongue, welcoming the sting because it meant I was still alive, still capable of feeling something that wasn't humiliation. My phone buzzed on the counter, a message from my brother. Just a meme. Some lazy attempt at humor that ignored the shrapnel of last night, and I deleted it without replying, because silence had become my weapon, sharper than any insult, and I wanted them to feel its edge. By the time the sky had turned slate gray, I was in my car, engine humming, driving nowhere in particular, just letting the road unravel before me, strip malls giving way to open fields, The kind of drive you take when the walls of your house feel too tight, and as the miles slid under the tires, I thought about patterns, about how betrayal doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's a repetition of small dismissals, ignored calls, forgotten birthdays, each one a seed, until one day you realize the whole garden has turned against you. And I knew I had been watering a family that never intended to bloom for me. I pulled into a gas station, grabbed another coffee from the machine, this one watery and burnt. And I stood outside under the buzzing lights watching truckers fuel their rigs, men with weathered faces who looked like they carried whole lifetimes on their backs. And I envied them for a moment because at least they knew the weight they bore, while mine was invisible, the kind that people dismissed with a shrug until it buckled you. The cup steamed in my hand, and I thought again about secrets, about the card I hadn't played, the advantage no one at that table last night suspected, and I let myself smile at the thought that when it surfaced, it wouldn't just tip the scales, it would shatter the whole balance. Driving again, I let the radio scan until it landed on an old station, Springsteen's Glory Days leaking through, and I laughed bitterly because wasn't that what my uncle had been selling, a myth of what once was, while I was sitting here crafting what would be? The song carried me back to high school football nights, the crowd under cheap lights, the smell of popcorn in the air, me under center calling plays, my sister in the stands cheering with pom-poms, and for a second the nostalgia cut deep, because once upon a time I really believed we were a team, that we'd grow up and carry each other, not abandon one another like strangers on a train. I turned the volume down before it could choke me and rolled down the window instead, cold wind slapping my face, clearing the fog, reminding me that the past is just an anchor unless you decide to cut the rope. By noon, I was back in the city, parking near the office building that loomed like a gray monolith, glass windows reflecting a sky that looked ready to split open, and I sat in the car for a moment staring at my own reflection in the rearview mirror. The lines under my eyes deeper than I remembered. The jaw tight, the man looking back, not the man who had walked into that restaurant last night. Inside, fluorescent lights hummed, keyboards clattered, phones rang, the symphony of corporate survival, and I forced myself into the rhythm because revenge isn't just about planning. It's about performance, about keeping your mask so convincing no one suspects you're sharpening knives under the desk. My coworker Jason swung by my cubicle, dropping a file with a grin, asking if I was up for drinks Friday, and I nodded, lying through my teeth because camaraderie felt impossible right now. But sometimes you smile and nod because blending in is its own form of camouflage. I answered emails, updated spreadsheets, attended meetings where jargon piled higher than the sky, and all the while I could feel the seed of last night's betrayal growing inside me, roots pushing deeper, twisting around my ribs until it felt like I could barely breathe. But I welcomed it, because growth, even painful growth, meant direction. That evening I hit the gym, the clang of weights and the thud of treadmills filling the air, sweat and rubber mixing into that familiar smell, and I pushed myself harder than usual. Each rep a silent vow, each bead of sweat a drop of the old Daniel burning away, and I thought about how discipline is the closest thing to revenge you can practice daily. Because every time you show up and push through, you're proving to yourself that you don't need applause or family or approval to exist, you only need grit. A guy next to me grunted as he racked his weights, giving me a nod of respect, and I nodded back, realizing that strangers in a gym gave me more acknowledgement than blood ever had. Leaving the gym, muscles aching, I walked into the night air and felt strangely lighter, as though I was shedding a skin I'd been forced to wear too long, and as I sat in my car, sweat cooling on my back, I whispered to myself, sometimes revenge isn't about what you do to them, it's about what you build in spite of them. Back home, I showered. Let the hot water pound my shoulders, steam fogging the mirror until I couldn't see myself. And I thought about how fitting that was, that maybe the man I'd been up to now deserved to disappear into fog, and the man stepping out would be someone they wouldn't recognize. Toweling off, I checked my phone and saw the family group chat lighting up, messages about some cousin's barbecue, jokes about wedding plans that didn't include me, and I muted it. Not with anger, but with a clarity that felt almost divine because I didn't need to shout about being excluded. Their silence was already the loudest confession. I brewed another cup of coffee, even though it was late, because the ritual felt grounding, and I sipped it at the kitchen table, staring at the unopened whiskey bottle I brought home from last week. The same brand as the one on the restaurant table, its cork glinting in the light. And I swore to myself that when the time came, when justice was mine to deliver, this bottle would be part of it, not as a drink, but as a symbol, a witness, a blade disguised as a gift. And with that thought, I leaned back in the chair, the bitterness of coffee on my tongue, the future unfurling in my head like a map I would soon set fire to once the destination was reached. I didn't sleep much that night, the coffee and the restless pacing keeping my nerves awake. And when I finally drifted off on the couch instead of the bed, it was to dreams jagged with images of wedding tables set without my name card, laughter muffled through glass walls I couldn't break, my sister in white surrounded by everyone I had carried on my back while I stood outside like some hired help dismissed before the photos. And when I woke to the gray smear of dawn seeping through the curtains, my chest ached as though I'd run miles in my sleep. But the ache didn't weaken me. It clarified me, because I realized then that exclusion can be the most powerful form of education. It teaches you exactly how valuable you've been by showing you how ungrateful they are. I brewed coffee again, hands moving automatically, inhaling the bitter steam. And as the first sip hit, I found myself staring at the kitchen table as though it were a drafting board. And I thought about all the times I'd paid their bills, bailed them out, answered calls at midnight, and I realized that if I'd invested that money in myself instead of them, I'd be standing in a very different house right now, maybe one with a view of the ocean or mountains instead of a cul-de-sac filled with people who waved, but never really knew me. That was when the seed of revenge sharpened into something tangible. If they wanted me absent, I give them absence, not just the silence of ignoring texts, but the kind of absence that burns when they look around and realize I'm not only missing, I'm thriving somewhere beyond their reach. The day stretched on at the office with the same endless hum of meetings and meaningless targets, but I was watching people differently now, noting the small betrayals that play out even in cubicles. Colleagues stealing credit, managers praising favorites, assistants left off emails, and it struck me that betrayal is universal. Only scale separates family treachery from office politics. And maybe that's why my plan felt so natural. I had been training for this my whole life. At lunch, I sat alone, scrolling through travel blogs on my phone. Places I'd always dismissed as too expensive, too indulgent, because I was always budgeting not for myself but for someone else's emergency. And as I flicked through photos of Santorini sunsets and Caribbean waters, so blue they looked unreal, I felt something inside me loosen, a realization that maybe revenge didn't have to look like fury. Maybe it could look like freedom, the kind that shines so bright it blinds those who thought they buried you. My coworker leaned over to ask if I was coming to the Friday happy hour, and I lied again, said maybe. But in my mind I was already boarding a plane, sunglasses on, boarding pass in hand, and I smiled to myself because lies told in service of survival taste less bitter than truths wasted on people who don't care. That evening the family group chat lit up again. Messages about wedding colors, dress fittings, logistics, jokes, the whole theater of celebration, and my name wasn't mentioned once, not even in passing. And though a part of me wanted to throw the phone across the room, I just muted the thread permanently, the notification bubble vanishing like a cut string. And the silence that followed felt like oxygen filling a space I didn't realize had been suffocating me. I turned on the TV, muted it after 5 minutes, and sat in the quiet, the whiskey bottle glinting on the counter, a reminder, a witness. And I thought again about rituals and betrayal, and I said aloud into the empty room, "Betrayal doesn't kill you, it educates you. And the smartest thing you can do with an education is turn it into profit." The words surprised me as they came out, but once spoken, they rooted themselves deep, and I knew they were true, knew that if I played this right, my sister's wedding would not be the story remembered, my absence would. I started sketching plans that night, opening travel sites, calculating budgets, realizing with a rush of exhilaration that the money I would have poured into their futures could instead catapult me into experiences they'd only ever see in magazines, and the thought of that poetic reversal filled me with a satisfaction I hadn't felt in years. I pictured myself poolside at some resort, sunglasses catching the sun, posting photos not out of vanity, but as silent declarations. This is what your betrayal built. The idea took root so fast it felt less like planning and more like uncovering something that had been waiting all along, like the secret card I'd kept pressed against my chest was finally revealing its face. I spent hours scrolling flights, making lists, researching excursions, and for the first time in months, the pounding in my chest wasn't dread but anticipation. Still, the nights weren't easy. I'd find myself pacing, remembering childhood summers when I'd pull my sister in a wagon down cracked sidewalks, when we'd share popsicles on the porch, when she'd call me her protector, and I'd feel that old loyalty rising like a ghost, whispering that maybe I should forgive, maybe I should swallow the slight, but every time the ghost grew loud, I pictured the restaurant. The smirk on my uncle's face, the coldness in my sister's eyes, the silence of my mother, and the ghost would dissolve, replaced by the steel certainty that forgiveness is just another word for giving them permission to repeat the crime. One night, after pouring a glass of water, I set it next to the whiskey bottle and stared at them side by side. One clear, one amber, one refreshing, one intoxicating, and it struck me that revenge has to hold both qualities, purity and fire, restraint and eruption, and I knew then that when the day came I would drink neither. I would let the bottle sit unopened as a monument to everything they thought they understood about me and everything they didn't. By the time Friday arrived, I had booked nothing but had dozens of tabs open, each one a doorway to a different future, and I carried that secret into work like a talisman, smiling at jokes I didn't care about, nodding through presentations I barely heard. Because underneath the disguise I was already elsewhere, already living in the parallel timeline where Daniel Hayes wasn't the family wallet, but the architect of his own escape. When Jason reminded me about the happy hour, I begged off, said I had errands, but instead I drove home, cooked a simple meal, poured coffee though the clock read nearly midnight, and sat in the dim kitchen with the steam rising from the mug, staring at the glow of my laptop screen, the cursor blinking like a heartbeat, and I thought to myself that revenge begins not with rage but with choice. The choice to no longer be their furniture, the choice to stand up and walk out of the room without explanation. And with that thought I clicked reserve on the first ticket, the confirmation email pinging seconds later, proof that the story had already turned, and though I didn't smile I felt something better. The steady calm of a man who had just chosen his battlefield. The confirmation email glowed on the screen like a secret pact between me and the universe, and as I sat there in the dim kitchen, coffee cooling beside me, I felt that peculiar quiet you get right before a storm, the kind of silence that isn't absence of noise but presence of inevitability, and in that quiet I whispered to myself that I was no longer theirs. No longer a limb they could sever when convenient or a pocket they could turn inside out, and the words felt like unshackling steel, like the first inhale after surfacing from deep water. The days that followed blurred into a performance, me going to work with the same mask, exchanging pleasantries with neighbors, even answering one of my mother's calls with a steady voice, nodding along as she spoke of dresses and venues and logistics, all the while knowing I had already cut the invisible rope tethering me to their celebration. At night, after dinner, I'd open the laptop and dive into research with a hunger I hadn't felt in years. Excursions into volcanic hot springs, dinners beneath the stars on private beaches, cliffside villas with infinity pools so clear they looked like glass dissolving into the ocean. And each image wasn't just a fantasy, it was a promise, a vow that if they wanted me to disappear from their story, I'd vanish so thoroughly they'd be forced to wonder where I had gone, and in that wondering they'd feel the sting of their own exclusion sharpened into irony. One evening, as I closed the blinds and shut the laptop, I noticed the whiskey bottle catching the last slant of light, and I walked over, ran my hand along the glass, feeling the coolness under my palm, and I told it, as if it were alive, not yet. When the moment comes, you'll know. It sounds strange now, talking to a bottle. But in that solitude, every object had taken on weight, symbolism, the way a soldier might polish his rifle not only for battle but to steady his mind. And that bottle became my mirror, my confessional, my reminder that restraint is its own weapon. At work, the noise of gossip and deadlines swirled, but I moved through it detached, as though my feet were already on foreign sand. And I realized how much of my life had been wasted worrying about outcomes for others, as though their approval were the currency of my existence. And that realization stung, but it also freed me. Because once you know you've been paying the wrong debt all along, you stop paying altogether. The family chat, muted now, still pulsed occasionally with photos and inside jokes, and though I didn't open it, I'd glimpse the previews on the lock screen. My sister's smile framed in pastel filters, captions about countdowns to the big day, emojis stacking like confetti, and instead of anger, I felt a strange calm detachment, as though watching strangers celebrate a holiday I didn't observe. Betrayal, I realized, is not just about cruelty. It's about dislocation, the way it shoves you outside of what you thought was your home, and once you accept that exile, you can stop hammering on locked doors and start building your own house. That night, I wrote in a notebook, the first page of something I hadn't done in years, and the words poured out almost as if dictated. Betrayal taught me that my blood is not my family, my choices. Betrayal taught me that silence is not weakness, it is a weapon. Betrayal taught me that revenge is not destruction, it is elevation. The sentences looked foreign but familiar, like a scripture I had always known but never spoken, and I underlined them 3 times, knowing they would carry me through the coming weeks. As the wedding drew closer, relatives began posting photos on social media. All smiles and rehearsals, hashtags stacking up, and I watched quietly from my own account, never liking, never commenting, just observing, and with each post I felt less like the abandoned and more like the invisible author of a parallel narrative that none of them suspected. I thought often of rituals, of how every culture has ceremonies meant to bind us together, yet betrayal has its own inverted rituals. The exclusion from group photos, the unreturned calls, the empty seat at a table, and I realized that what they had given me wasn't erasure but initiation, the painful induction into a different kind of family, the one you build from chosen silence, from strangers met across the world, from moments too vivid to be shared in a group chat. I booked another leg of the trip, an island I'd only ever seen in magazines, and when the second confirmation email pinged, I laughed softly to myself, not from humor but from recognition, because I saw now that my revenge wasn't a single act but a pilgrimage, each ticket another step away from their betrayal and toward my rebirth. But nights remained complicated, filled with flashes of memory that struck uninvited. My sister at 8 years old tugging on my sleeve during thunderstorms, my mother humming in the kitchen while I did homework, my uncle slapping me on the back during birthdays with a grin that now seems sinister in retrospect. And those memories could have broken me if I let them. But instead I treated them like weights in a gym, lifting them, feeling their resistance, and in the lifting I grew stronger. One particularly restless night, I took the whiskey bottle from the counter, carried it to the porch, and sat watching the moon climb through the trees, the glass heavy in my hand, and I whispered again, "Not yet," before setting it down untouched, because drinking it would have been surrender, and I needed every ounce of clarity for what was to come. The closer the wedding loomed, the more the world around me seemed to conspire in affirmations. Co-workers talking about bucket list trips, strangers in cafes discussing places I had just booked, even a billboard on my drive home flashing images of turquoise water and palm trees. And each sign reminded me that timing is not coincidence, it is choreography, and I was finally moving in step with a rhythm larger than myself. On the final night before their ceremony, while they rehearsed toasts and dances, I was in my kitchen with my suitcase open, folding clothes with precision, tucking in small comforts, sliding my passport into its sleeve, and the silence of that preparation felt like the holiest ritual of my life. I didn't toast to them, I didn't curse them, I didn't even cry, I simply zipped the suitcase shut and set it by the door, the sound of the zipper like a final verdict. When dawn came, I dressed simply, carried the suitcase to the car, and paused only once at the door to glance back at the whiskey bottle, still gleaming in the corner of the kitchen. I didn't take it. I didn't smash it. I left it exactly where it was, a relic of everything I had survived, and as the door clicked shut behind me, I felt no urge to look back again. The drive to the airport was quiet, the radio off, the world outside rushing past, and when I finally walked through the sliding glass doors and saw the departure boards glowing above me, I felt something profound. Not joy, not triumph, but release. The way a bird must feel when the cage door is left open, not flying out in frenzy, but in deliberate, steady strokes, carrying itself toward skies it was always meant to inhabit. And as I handed over my boarding pass, the agent smiling absently, I thought to myself that the sweetest revenge is not in proving them wrong, but in living so fully they never get the chance to define you again. The plane lifted off with a soft shudder of inevitability, and as the city shrank beneath me into a mosaic of lights dissolving into clouds, I felt the last tether snap, the final evidence that I no longer occupied the orbit they had cast me into. And for the first time in months, my lungs expanded without the constriction of memory. The air inside the cabin smelled faintly of coffee and recycled anticipation, but to me it carried the fragrance of rebirth. Because this wasn't just a flight, it was an exodus, a deliberate rewriting of my own scripture, and every mile carried me further away from the altar where they would pretend unity without me. As I stared out the window, the ocean glittering like shattered obsidian under the morning sun, I thought about how betrayal is usually marked by absence, an empty chair, an unopened invitation. But what I was crafting was presence, an overwhelming abundance of life, so vivid that their celebration would pale against it. not because I was there to oppose it, but because I had outgrown the need for their stage. Hours later, stepping out into the humidity of the first island, I was greeted by a rush of air so warm it felt like an embrace. And as the driver held up a placard with my name, I felt a small surge of pride, because here, thousands of miles from the kitchen where I had whispered to a bottle, I was recognized, awaited, significant. The villa was carved into the cliffs, its walls opening like a breath onto a horizon that seemed infinite, the infinity pool spilling seamlessly into the turquoise ocean below. And when I walked to its edge, the water trembling under the breeze, I thought of their banquet hall, chandeliers, white tablecloths, glasses clinking, and realized how hollow it would look next to this living cathedral of sea and sky. That evening, I dressed not in bitterness but in quiet defiance, linen shirt open at the throat, bare feet padding across cool stone, and I dined alone under a canopy of stars so sharp they looked like punctures in the dark, the sound of waves crashing in rhythm with my heartbeat, and I raised a glass of water, not whiskey, not wine, and toasted to myself, whispering the words aloud. You were never theirs to erase. You were always yours to become. The food arrived in courses that felt ceremonial, fresh fish, herbs so fragrant they lingered in the air like memory, desserts that melted into sweetness before I could even swallow. And as I tasted each bite, I thought of the family gathered around their menu choices, debating entrees, trying to appease dozens of guests, and I laughed softly because this was the feast they could never imagine. Not because it was extravagant, but because it was mine, chosen, savored without compromise. The next morning, I rose before dawn and walked down to the shore. The sand cool underfoot, the tide pulling in slow, patient sighs, and I stood there watching the first thread of light unravel across the horizon. And in that liminal moment between night and day, I spoke aloud again, to no one and to everything. This is my ceremony, this is my vow, and the words dissolved into the salt air, carried farther than any prayer I had ever whispered under a church roof. Later, as I boarded a small boat to another island, the engine humming beneath me, I pulled out the notebook and began to write, not about them, not even about betrayal, but about the texture of the water, the faces of strangers who smiled as though I belonged, the way the sun licked the back of my neck like some benevolent hand, and page after page, filled not with bitterness but with life. And I realized the revenge was not a strike but a flood, overwhelming in its quiet persistence. I imagined them rehearsing vows in front of their guests, reciting words about loyalty and family, while I scribbled truths under an open sky, truths no officiant could sanctify, but which carried more weight because they were lived, not staged. That night, alone again, I lit a candle on the villa balcony, placed the notebook beside me, and opened my phone, the screen lighting my face as I scrolled briefly through their posts. Photos of dresses, bouquets, staged laughter, and instead of hurt, I felt only distance, as if watching a performance in a language I no longer spoke. I closed the phone, let the candle burn low, and watched the stars shift in their endless choreography, and in that endlessness, I found comfort. Because what is betrayal against the backdrop of eternity? A ripple, a shadow. A temporary wound that scars only if you let it. By the time I lay down to sleep, the waves whispering against the rocks below, I knew part one of my pilgrimage had begun, and I could feel part two waiting beyond the horizon. More islands, more revelations, more silent victories. And I smiled into the darkness, knowing tomorrow the story would continue not in their banquet hall but in mine, written in water, salt, and sky. The following morning the sun rose like a slow-blooming ember over the water, and I found myself awake before it, standing barefoot on the balcony with the salt breeze combing through my hair, realizing that in all the years of my life I had rarely allowed myself to greet a day on my own terms, always tied to schedules, obligations, the demands of those who mistook my loyalty for servitude, but here I was unbound, each dawn a gift I alone unwrapped. The driver arrived promptly to take me to the harbor, and soon I was boarding a sleek catamaran with a handful of strangers, their laughter bubbling like champagne, and though we exchanged only smiles and fragments of conversation, I felt more kinship in their fleeting joy than I had in decades of blood-bound duty. The boat skimmed across the sea, white spray leaping like silver ribbons, and as the coastline receded I thought of the banquet hall again, their orchestrated performance of family unity, and I imagined the moment they would glance at the empty chair that should have been mine, perhaps dismissing it with a shrug, perhaps not mentioning me at all, but in that omission lay my liberation. For the empty chair was not evidence of loss, but proof of sovereignty. We dropped anchor near a reef, the water so crystalline it seemed unreal, and when I slid beneath the surface, mask snug against my face, the world exploded into color. Corals blazing like molten stone, schools of fish weaving in perfect synchrony, shafts of sunlight cutting down like cathedral beams. And I laughed underwater, bubbles streaming from my mouth because this was the ceremony I had chosen. Vows exchanged not with people who had broken theirs, but with the ocean itself, a witness both merciless and eternal. Later, drying on deck with the salt tight on my skin, I thought of how betrayal had once felt like drowning, each wave heavier than the last. But now I saw that immersion was not suffocation but baptism. The very water that once threatened to pull me under now lifting me into light. By the time we returned to shore, I was drunk not on alcohol but on vitality, and as I walked back into the villa, towel slung over my shoulder, I noticed the notebook waiting where I had left it, pages fluttering in the breeze as if eager to be filled, and I wrote furiously about the way fish shimmered like fragments of stained glass, about the way the horizon seemed endless and forgiving, about the way strangers' laughter felt more honest than the applause of kin. That evening, I booked a helicopter tour over the islands, and as the rotors thundered and we lifted from the earth, the islands unfurled beneath me like emerald jewels set into a sapphire crown, each one promising another revelation, another victory, another chapter in the revenge I was no longer enacting upon them but upon the man I used to be. Hovering above waterfalls that plunged like liquid silver into jungle canopies, I whispered to myself, "You are not their exile. You are your own return." And I realized that the true punishment for them was not my absence but my transformation, a story they could never claim as their own, because they had chosen to erase me from theirs. That night I celebrated in solitude again, but solitude no longer felt like emptiness. It felt like intimacy with the universe itself, the candle flickering against the villa walls as the sea whispered a lullaby, and I poured water into the ceremonial bottle, the one I had carried from the kitchen of humiliation, watching it glisten in the flame as if sanctifying this journey, and I realized it had become my chalice, a relic of betrayal turned into a vessel of renewal. I lifted it in a silent toast, not to them, never again to them, but to the boy I once was, to the man I had become, to the horizon that awaited. As the candle burned lower, I pictured their rehearsal dinner happening at that very moment, their glasses raised, their laughter bouncing off chandeliers, and I smiled because somewhere in their rehearsed perfection, there must be a faint awareness, even unspoken, that they had lost not just a relative but a witness, the one who had always silently carried the weight of their narratives, and without me their story was incomplete, their unity and illusion cracked at its foundation. Yet I did not gloat. I only breathed, steady and free, because revenge was no longer a fire I had to stoke. It was the air itself, surrounding me, lifting me, undeniable. I fell asleep with the sound of waves crashing against stone, and as dreams carried me into silence, I knew that tomorrow would bring another island, another revelation, another unshakable truth, that my absence from their wedding was not erasure but elevation, and the world itself had conspired to become my cathedral. The morning of the wedding arrived like a quiet drumbeat, though I felt it not through calendars or invitations, but through the pulse of inevitability, a day etched into their rituals yet scrubbed clean of me. And as I opened the shutters to let the sunlight pierce the villa, I realized with a strange serenity that somewhere thousands of miles away they were tying knots of silk and lies while I was tying myself to the wind and the tide, threads no hand could sever. I dressed simply, linen shirt unbuttoned at the throat, shorts, sandals, because my attire needed no approval, no whispered judgment from relatives comparing cufflinks or pocket squares, and I walked down to the beach where a private yacht waited, sleek and gleaming like a blade honed for liberation. The captain greeted me with the easy professionalism of someone who had no stake in my story, and as the vessel surged into the open sea, I stood at the bow, salt spray baptizing me again, hair whipped back, heart drumming not with nerves, but with a strange anticipation, as if some unseen orchestra were tuning their instruments for a ceremony that was mine alone. I had brought the bottle with me, filled now with the clearest water I could draw from the villa's tap, and it sat in my bag, its weight both ordinary and sacred, a reminder that objects only wound when we allow them to remain weapons instead of relics. Hours passed as the yacht carved its path between scattered islands, and when we finally anchored near a secluded cove where the sand gleamed like powdered pearls, I felt the day split into two realities, theirs and mine, and I knew without doubt which one carried more truth. I stepped barefoot onto the beach, leaving footprints that the tide immediately began to erase, and I laughed at the symbolism of it, at how the universe itself insisted that I belonged to no track, no script, no duty. In the distance, a bonfire had been prepared by staff I had arranged days earlier, logs stacked high, torches ready to be lit, and I realized I had built myself an altar, not out of fuse or floral arches, but out of flame and salt and solitude. As twilight descended, painting the horizon with molten orange, I sat at a table set for one, white cloth billowing in the wind, a 5-course meal prepared by a chef who served with quiet reverence. And as I tasted each dish, the grilled fish seasoned perfectly, the tropical fruits sliced like jewels, I thought of their reception, the clinking of glasses, the orchestrated toasts, and I wondered if any of them, even for a fleeting second, felt the ghost of my presence. Between courses, I poured myself wine and stared at the fire, the flames writhing like serpents, and I set the bottle beside me, half in shadow, half in glow, as though it were absorbing both the darkness of betrayal and the light of rebirth. At some point music began to play, soft guitar carried by hidden speakers, a melody so achingly beautiful it could have been mistaken for the hymn of angels, and I realized with a jolt that this was my wedding, not to another person, but to myself, vows spoken in silence, promises carved into the marrow of my bones. I will no longer sacrifice for those who scorn me. I will no longer kneel where love is conditional. I will no longer bleed for the applause of ghosts. I lifted the bottle in a toast and whispered, "Here's to choosing absence over illusion." And as the words left my lips, I felt them settle into the air like iron truths. The bonfire roared higher, sparks spiraling into the night sky like 1,000 untethered souls, and I imagined that at the very same hour my sister might be cutting her cake, family clustered around her, their cameras flashing, their laughter rehearsed, and I wanted her to see me as I was now, but of course she couldn't, and that was the beauty of it, that my ceremony was invisible to them, a secret sacrament they would never desecrate. By the time dessert was served, the stars had conquered the sky, sharp and endless, and I leaned back in my chair, belly warm, heart steady, and I thought of the man I used to be, the one who believed duty was love, who mistook sacrifice for loyalty, who let his worth be measured in checks written and debts forgiven, and I almost pitied him, the ghost version of myself who would have been in that ballroom, smiling politely, swallowing hurt, clapping when told. Almost. But pity is a chain, and I would not drag it into this new life. Instead, I rose, walked barefoot into the shallows, the water cool against my calves, and with both hands I lifted the bottle high, its glass catching firelight and starlight, and then with a breath that felt like severance, I hurled it into the sea, watching it arc, shimmer, and disappear with a soft splash, carried instantly by the tide into eternity. I stood there a long while, water lapping against me, fire blazing behind me, and I realized the bottle had never belonged to me, nor to them. It belonged to the story itself, and now it was gone, free, as I was. Later, lying in a hammock strung between palms, the fire burning down to embers, I closed my eyes and for the first time in years, I dreamed not of obligations unmet or debts unacknowledged, but of endless coastlines, of mornings that asked nothing of me but breath, of a life written in waves instead of ledgers. I woke near dawn to the sound of gulls and knew with unshakable certainty that their wedding had come and gone, their rituals completed, their photographs staged, their unity proclaimed, but my revenge was still unfolding, not in spectacle but in silence, not in confrontation but in transformation, and I smiled because that, in the end, was the truest punishment of all, to erase myself from their narrative and write one they could never touch. Dawn broke in molten silence, the horizon bleeding pink and gold as if the world itself had been reborn overnight. And I rose from the hammock with the languid ease of someone no longer carrying invisible weights, though I knew deep inside that the true reckoning had only just begun, for revenge, like the tide, never crashes all at once but creeps steadily, lapping higher until the careless find their feet swept out from under them. I brewed strong coffee in the villa's kitchen, the aroma curling through open windows, and as I sipped it on the balcony overlooking the endless blue, I thought of them boarding flights back home, their smiles brittle with exhaustion, Their wedding bands still warm on their fingers, their minds already shifting to honeymoons and mortgage, and whispered discussions about how little they owed me, if anything at all. But what they could not know, not yet, was that the silent ledger I had been keeping had ripened into a trap too intricate to escape, a system I had designed with the patience of a gardener, planting seeds years earlier, watering them with silence, pruning them with apparent compliance, until now the fruits hung heavy, waiting only for the perfect moment to drop. The beauty of it was that I never lifted a finger in anger, never shouted, never slammed a door, because anger leaves trails. Anger invites suspicion, while silence is mistaken for surrender. And in that miscalculation, they signed documents they didn't read, accepted conditions they didn't question, built their new life on foundations I had poured but never disclosed. I had once been the executor of family trusts, the guarantor of quiet loans, the man whose signature was required for properties to exchange hands. And while they thought me foolish for never demanding repayment, they did not realize that in those moments of so-called weakness, I was weaving contracts of dependency so subtle that the ink itself seemed invisible. Now, with the wedding behind them, with their hands clasped tightly in triumph, I knew it was time to let the machinery hum to life. I opened my laptop, the same silver device I had carried like an unremarkable companion through boardrooms and bedrooms, and with a few keystrokes I logged into the quiet accounts, the holding companies, the labyrinth of entities that bore my fingerprints, but not my name, and as the screen illuminated with balances and deeds, I smiled. Not out of greed, but out of vindication. For every line was proof that I had never been the discarded patriarch they imagined, but rather the architect of their entire facade. The sea murmured below, indifferent to my revelations, and I whispered to it. They married into air, not stone, and the waves answered with a crash that felt like applause. Still, I was not cruel enough to ruin them in a single blow. That would be too merciful, too swift. Instead, I would let the world itself play judge, jury, and executioner. I prepared a series of envelopes, each addressed to institutions, attorneys, creditors, each containing not accusations but clarifications, copies of contracts and trusts and deeds that revealed the truth of who owned what, who owed what, who was merely a guest in a house they believed theirs. I did not need to send them all at once. No, I would release them like tide pools spilling into the sea, slowly, relentlessly, until every illusion they held dissolved. By late morning, as the sun burned hot against my shoulders, I carried the first envelope to the village post office, an unremarkable building painted in peeling blue, and with a steady hand I slid it across the counter, a simple act that felt like pulling a trigger. Walking back along the beach, I thought of the bottle I had thrown the night before, and I realized its symbolism was more intricate than I had first believed. For just as that bottle had vanished into the sea, so too would their certainty vanish into bureaucracy, swallowed by tides of paperwork, court dates, audits, a storm, not of rage but of consequence. I spent the afternoon swimming, letting the salt buoy me, imagining their faces when the first notices arrived, when they realized the accounts they relied upon were not theirs to touch, when their so-called home was revealed as collateral on debts they had never understood, and I almost pitied them, almost. But pity was a language I no longer spoke. That night, as the villa lights cast warm circles on the sand, I poured myself another glass of wine and sat at the balcony with the sea as my witness, and I thought of my sister's vows, words I had never heard but could easily imagine, promises of loyalty, fidelity, permanence, and I laughed softly, because permanence was the cruelest myth of all. Nothing lasts except the truths buried deep, and mine were about to surface with a force they could not deny. I raised my glass to the horizon and whispered, "The wedding was only the prologue. The real story begins now." Morning arrived with the shrill cry of gulls slicing the air above the villa, and though the sea shimmered in its usual innocence, I felt an invisible thread tugging at the other side of the world, a tremor that told me the first envelope had already begun its quiet devastation, that somewhere across the continent a courier had slipped it into the hands of a clerk, and the gears of bureaucracy had started grinding with their merciless patience, a machine that once set in motion can never be halted by panic or prayer. I pictured them waking in the afterglow of their vows, sunlight spilling through curtains, the taste of champagne still on their tongues, and then a phone vibrating insistently on the knitstand, an unfamiliar number, a clipped voice explaining that there were discrepancies in certain accounts, that signatures did not align, that assets, thought secured, were in fact held in trust by someone else entirely. And I could almost see their expressions curdle, joy souring into the first trace of fear. Fear is a slow poison. It doesn't kill in a moment, it corrodes steadily. And that was the genius of the structure I had built, because each new letter, each new call, each new knock at the door would only deepen the cracks until what they thought was bedrock collapsed into sand. By mid-morning, I was walking through the island's narrow streets, past fruit vendors calling out in lilting voices, children chasing one another barefoot. The simplicity of life here, a deliberate contrast to the complexity unraveling back home, and I felt both spectator and conductor of a symphony they could not hear, but were already dancing to. Later, stretched out beneath a palm tree, I thought about how they might attempt to reach me. The hurried texts, the unanswered calls, the increasingly desperate voicemails, but my phone remained silent in a drawer, switched off because silence itself was part of the punishment, forcing them to speak into a void that never replied. I imagined the dinner table that evening, their smiles strained, forks clinking against plates as they pretended nothing was wrong, while beneath the table their legs twitched with restless energy, their minds rehearsing explanations they did not yet believe themselves. And I savored it not as cruelty but as balance restored, the scales slowly tilting back to their rightful weight. At dusk I returned to the villa and found the stack of remaining envelopes waiting like loyal soldiers, and I carefully prepared the next wave, each one addressed with precision, each containing a truth wrapped in legalese. And I thought of how my handwriting itself must look to the clerks who received it, steady, uncompromised, the penmanship of a man who had long since stopped trembling. I sealed them, pressed wax to flap, and whispered to each, as though it were a prayer, "Go and do what must be done," before placing them in a leather satchel by the door. That night I dined alone again, though alone no longer felt accurate, because I dined with the company of their unraveling, each glass of wine paired with the image of them realizing another brick of their fortress was missing. I could almost hear the conversation when they finally confronted each other, him accusing her of knowing more than she had admitted, her insisting he had been careless, both turning over the possibility that perhaps, just perhaps, I had never been the silent casualty they assumed, but something far more dangerous, the author of their fate. And that realization, whenever it bloomed, would be the moment they understood that revenge is not always thunder in the skies. Sometimes it is rain dripping steadily until the house floods. I walked onto the balcony, barefoot, glass in hand, and stared at the horizon where lightning flickered faintly. Too far to hear but bright enough to promise a storm. And I thought of them lying awake in their marital bed, pretending to sleep while their minds whirred, and I smiled, because sleep is the first luxury that deserts the guilty, and they would soon find nights as endless as the ones I once endured. In that symmetry there was justice, and in justice there was peace, and in peace there was the sweetest kind of revenge, one that did not shout, but whispered, and was all the more devastating for it. By the time the second week dawned on the island, my mornings were filled with the rhythm of waves crashing against stone, but across the ocean my sister's new life was already fracturing in places too small for outsiders to notice, yet too sharp for her to ignore, and that was the beauty of the trap. It didn't explode. It leaked, a slow bleed that stained everything they touched, so that even their laughter began to carry an echo of fear. I heard about it not directly, but in the way information always travels. A friend of a friend, an email forwarded to someone I trusted, a screenshot of their carefully curated social posts where smiles looked brittle, captions overcompensated with exclamation marks, the subtle giveaway of people trying to convince themselves more than the world. Meanwhile, the machinery of institutions, banks, lawyers, tax offices, moved at its glacial pace, relentless, faceless, unstoppable, and each letter I had sent was like another pebble dropped into water, ripples overlapping until they formed waves too large to control. Their accounts were flagged for review, his business loans called into question, her credit card frozen one afternoon as she tried to purchase something mundane, maybe flowers or groceries, and the humiliation of being told her card had been declined must have bitten deeper than any open confrontation. Public humiliation had been their gift to me, and now I had returned it in a form far crueler, because while theirs was one loud moment, mine would be a string of small humiliations that piled endlessly, suffocating them in plain sight. And the whispers started, as I knew they would, because friends and family in our circles are not blind. They sense weakness like sharks scenting blood, and soon the same cousins and uncles who toasted their wedding began asking quiet questions at barbecues and church gatherings, wondering why his company's name had disappeared from sponsorship flyers. Why her once flashy Instagram posts now lingered weeks between updates, and gossip, once unleashed, cannot be called back. I sat at a seaside cafe when I saw the first photograph surface online, them together at a dinner party, his smile thin, her gaze unfocused, the caption from a mutual acquaintance reading simply, "Strange night," and I nearly laughed aloud because strangers had already begun documenting their unraveling without realizing it. And yet, the greatest satisfaction came not from their visible cracks, but from their silence toward me, because the absence of confrontation meant they did not know how deep my hand reached, whether I had more, whether at any moment another trapdoor might open beneath them, and in that uncertainty I held absolute power. Still, I was not reckless. I knew revenge without precision is just destruction, so I continued my routine: morning swims, afternoon rides along the coastal roads, evenings with a book and a bottle of wine, because to live well in their absence was itself a weapon. Every photograph I posted of sunsets and beaches another needle in their pride, proof that I thrived while they withered. Yet behind my calm I nurtured one final flourish, because revenge without poetry is incomplete, and I wanted my closing act to tie every thread together with the neatness of fate itself. So one night, as the wind howled and the shutters rattled, I drafted a final package: documents, photographs, receipts, and tucked within them a single symbolic thing they would recognize instantly. The small silver keychain shaped like a diner coffee mug. The one I had given my sister years ago when she was broke and desperate. When I told her over pancakes and burnt coffee that she would always have me in her corner, that I would help her find her footing no matter how many times she stumbled. She had carried it for years, until she stopped, until the wedding invitations went out to everyone but me, and I knew when she opened this package and saw that keychain again, she would remember both the promise and the betrayal, and understand that the object she once clutched as a reminder of love had become the emblem of her undoing. I wrapped it carefully, addressed it to their new home, and left it in the hands of a courier who would never know what storm he was delivering. And when I stepped back into the salt-heavy night air, I felt the cycle close like a door locking with a satisfying click. The final twist was not just that I had orchestrated their ruin, but that I had done so with the very symbol of my loyalty, turned inside out, proof that betrayal can transform even the most innocent tokens into weapons sharper than knives. And as I walked back toward the villa, the island alive with music and laughter from taverns where strangers danced without care, I felt something rare, something deeper than victory. I felt release, as though the weight I had carried all those years had dissolved into the sea breeze, leaving me not whole, perhaps, but free, and freedom was all I had ever wanted from them. If this story resonated with you, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe. It helps us share more true stories like this.